welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the journalist Tim Schwab. He is the author of the new book, The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of the Good Billionaire, available from Metropolitan Books. Tim Schwab has reported on Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation for The Nation, the Columbia Journalism Review, and elsewhere. His book collects a lot of the findings of his journalism over the past few years. Tim, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. It's an honor to be here.
How long have you been looking into the Gates Foundation? I can't remember. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I started looking at Gates in 2019, so it hasn't been exclusively only on that topic, but it has been a number of years I've been looking at the Gates Foundation.
Yeah, and the book covers every aspect of it. And so let's start perhaps with the image of the Gates Foundation. Before you take us to the reality, let's begin with the image. Perhaps you could tell us how the Gates Foundation presents itself and has been perceived by those who are its supporters.
Well, we could include its supporters. We could include much of the news media, I think, which have really done a very important job in crafting the Gates narrative. This is the world's largest private foundation, charitable foundation. It's giving away billions of dollars and it's saving lives. This is an organization that proceeds from the mission that all lives have equal value. It works in many different fields, from agricultural development to public health to public education to contraceptive access. So it really has far-ranging influence in a great number of public policies, but it presents itself very much as this force of good, this unimpeachable, innocent philanthropy that has one goal, which is really to help the poor.
I wanted to ask you, just procedurally, one of the things that comes up a lot in the book is that you are examining this story of the Gates Foundation to see the extent to which it is true versus not true. There are a great number of challenges to reporting effectively on this because it is so powerful, and you run into a lot of stonewalling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in one regard, I guess we shouldn't be surprised. This is, at this point, a $67 billion institution. And like any large, powerful, wealthy institution, it becomes very conservative. It becomes very interested in preserving its power and erecting high walls to keep curious eyes from probing. So the foundation, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, I guess you would expect, if the Gates Foundation is, as it presents, this unimpeachable humanitarian body, they would be eager to talk to journalists and others, academic researchers also, about their work, about what they're doing, how they're doing it, where they've had success and where they've had failures. But the Gates Foundation would never sit for an interview with me before I published my first article on the Gates Foundation or established myself as a critic. I'm not alone in this experience. There are a number of journalists and academic scholars who have investigated the Gates Foundation. And the foundation generally does not engage with outside investigators that might challenge the logic of its work or really question the merits of what it's doing.
I feel, just to dwell on that a little bit, I think it is reasonable to expect that such a powerful institution should welcome scrutiny, right? I mean, I would hope that an organization that really is just a totally neutral, we're here to give money to the poor, would have absolutely nothing to fear from journalism, because they say, come on in, we'll show you how we give money to the poor and all the things we do to help. And then you can look at it and you won't be able to criticize it.
Absolutely. And the real trigger for accountability here is this issue of taxes, that the Gates Foundation is a nonprofit, tax-privileged private foundation. So billions of dollars in public funds and tax benefits and subsidies flow into the Gates Foundation. So that's a real trigger of accountability, that we should be able to follow the money. We should be able to see how the money is spent. We should have checks and balances over how Bill Gates is spending our money.
Now, you mention also in the book that getting people who have worked with the Gates Foundation or who could tell you some things about it is also quite challenging, because it's not just that the foundation itself is not very open to scrutiny. It's also that they're responsible for dispersing so much money to other organizations and to researchers that, a researcher who publicly criticizes the Gates Foundation really is opening themselves up to pretty negative career consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to realize that the Gates Foundation, it is this massive institution in downtown Seattle, but is also a massive network of organizations. Through the thousands of charitable grants the Gates Foundation gets, it brings a great many individuals, institutions, organizations into its financial sphere of influence. Researchers in the field of global health, which is the term for public health for poor people, where the Gates Foundation is arguably the most powerful and influential actor, where very few institutions or individuals are either not funded by the Gates Foundation or 1 or 2 degrees away from the Gates Foundation. Researchers in that field have coined this term, the bill chill, to describe the chilling effect that really pervades that whole field, where it's just a classic situation where people and institutions are afraid to bite the hand that feeds them. And I think with good cause, because the Gates Foundation is very sensitive to public relations. It is very intent on crafting and writing its own narrative. It tends, when it funds people, it expects them to get in line to follow the Gates Foundation's agenda and its priorities. Many people don't feel like they can speak openly or freely about the Gates Foundation. I have a whole chapter in the book about transparency because it's such an important theme in understanding the Gates Foundation. I would reach out in the course of my reporting, I reached out to former employees of the Gates Foundation. And the most common response you'd get is, sorry, Tim, I can't talk because I signed an NDA as I was leaving the foundation. And you have to wonder again, how do we square this culture of secrecy and opacity with the common definition of charity, of humanitarianism, of philanthropy? Why in the world would the Gates Foundation be asking outgoing employees to sign non-disclosure or non-disparagement agreements? Why do so many former employees feel scared to speak out or speak up? It's one of endless paradoxes that defines the Gates Foundation.
And you have discovered evidence that there are reasons why they might not want their employees to speak publicly about the internal organizational culture of the Gates Foundation.
Well, of any aspect of the Gates Foundation, internally or externally. I mean, we can't hold the Gates Foundation accountable if we don't know what it's doing. So this opacity is very much by design. It's also the complexity of the Gates Foundation where it's funding other groups. It might sit on their board of directors. It might be the largest funder of these outside NGOs. But these outside NGOs can do the work that the Gates Foundation essentially prescribes for them. And it gives the Gates Foundation some kind of buffer. It's just the more you start to peel back the layers of the onion, the more complex you understand that the Gates Foundation is. And all of this complexity, again, is by design. It makes it very difficult to really unravel the totality of what the Gates Foundation is doing, where it's operating, who's funded by it.
And we should mention that even in your own profession, journalism, there's a lot of Gates-funded work. I mean, I have read articles in The Guardian, I think, or like Vox or so, places to where you get to the bottom of the article and it goes, this article was brought to you by the generous sponsorship of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you think, wow, how generous. But also, do we really want journalists on the payroll of a powerful private institution that isn't accountable to anyone?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think journalists just writ large need to stop accepting charitable donations from the Gates Foundation because it's not an innocent charitable donation. This really is buying influence over the news media. One thing I did in my reporting was look at every charitable grant the Gates Foundation has ever given away. And from that, you can start to see most or some of the money anyway that the Gates Foundation is giving to journalism. And at this point, it's more than $300 million in charitable donations. And there's very few large legacy traditional media outlet newsrooms that are untouched by the Gates Foundation's funding. Le Monde, Der Spiegel, BBC, The Guardian, the Financial Times, Al Jazeera, Publica at one time took funding from the Gates Foundation. The New York Times and the Washington Post, to my knowledge, haven't taken charitable donations from Gates, but there are columnists working there writing about the Gates Foundation who have outside employment with journalism organizations funded by the Gates Foundation. In the situation you described, where you read an article and at the end it says brought to you by Gates, is the best case scenario. There are many times in many places where newsrooms are reporting on the Gates Foundation and not disclosing to readers that they're also receiving funding from the Gates Foundation. Generally speaking, the subject of your reporting, the target of your investigation, cannot also be your funder. It's just a blatant financial conflict of interest, but it's become so normalized. And the news media has really been, it's an important character in the book because it's been such an important accomplice to Bill Gates. in terms of normalizing and legitimizing his model of power, his growing power in world affairs on the world stage. All of the articles about Gates is giving away millions of dollars, what has this charitable ambition, it intends to do this thing in global health. It's all of this forward-looking, almost hagiographic reporting about what the Gates Foundation wants to be, what it hopes to achieve. But there's very little of kind of at the moment reporting saying, well, why is Bill Gates meeting with the Chancellor of Germany? Why is Bill Gates meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan? Why is he meeting as a peer-to-peer, influencing government priorities, influencing government spending? That's not normal.
I want to get more into this question of the actual effectiveness and how you can measure what they've actually done. But I just wanted to note, you did mention the New York Times. I read that the New York Times reviewed your book, and they were very mad. But one of the funny things about their review is that they thought they thought you're too harsh on nice old Bill Gates. But there's this moment in it where they go, Schwab criticizes the New York Times because we failed to disclose that a pair of contributors who'd written favorably about the Gates Foundation ran an organization that was largely bankrolled by it. And they say, okay, that's fair.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The New York Times is a big place. I'm sure there's a heterogeneity. I think there's probably a lot of people who work there who would get it, who get the criticism I'm making, the arguments I'm making, who appreciate the investigative journalism that went into it. But yeah, the guy who reviewed it didn't get it. So, so it goes.
What I think is funny is that even in the review, they have to disclose that they will say, okay, fair enough, we do have a Gates problem ourselves, right? It's like no one is untouched by this. Like even someone who's trying to write a critical review of your book is going, okay, yeah, there's a kind of Gates problem here too.
Yes, absolutely.
Because of the tentacles touch everything.
Yeah, that review ended by saying billionaires exist, period. And as long as billionaires exist, shouldn't we hope that they give away their money instead of hoarding it? And that just misunderstood the fundamental, right?
I thought that was totally fascinating because it's like, look, you're essentially criticizing the whole existing economic structure by which a small number of people are empowered to decide who lives and dies. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. It just misses the point that it's not giving away money. The way that Bill Gates operates, it's not giving away money. It's exercising power. It's buying influence, right?
That's the other point. You say, is he really even a philanthropist or Yeah,
I mean, it's easy to look at the Gates Foundation and say, well, what's wrong with him putting billions of dollars into fighting malaria, to delivering vaccines? If you get vaccines into the arms of the global poor, of course, that can save lives and improve lives. And that's all true, but only superficially, only if you aren't considering the counterfactuals, the opportunity costs and the collateral damage. I mean, if you think about how many different ways you could deliver vaccines, the Gates model is partnering with big pharma, treating the large pharmaceutical companies as humanitarian partners. But of course, there's many other ways to approach the distributions of vaccines, including challenging big pharma, shaming and embarrassing them to say, why is it that we have these life-saving vaccines that millions of people around the world can't access because they're too expensive? There's so many ways to look at the Gates model and think about alternatives.
Right. I want to dwell on what you said because I think it's so important, this idea of counterfactuals and opportunity costs, because the classic standard defense that I've read, and everyone who is critical of your take says, but look, they're doing good. Here are some good things they do. Would you rather this not have happened? And the only counterfactual they're willing to consider is Bill Gates gave nothing and he bought a bunch of yachts. And you say, well, and they say, well, but he did these things. But when we try and evaluate the good that is done, we have to think about the full range of alternate possibilities. If we had a hospital, say, and the hospital turned away half of the patients that showed up even though they had empty beds, they could say, well, look, we saved hundreds of lives. Look at all the people we did treat. Would you rather the hospital not have been here at all? And that's not a defense, right? Because the argument is you had the resources to save a bunch of lives. You didn't. Or if they kill half their patients and they say, well, look at the half that we did save. Would you rather we have saved nobody? That's not a reasonable defense. And yet that is the defense that is made every time the criticisms that you make are made.
Yeah. And this part of this gets back to the incredible epistemic power that the Gates Foundation has to write its own narrative, to control its own narrative. We talked about the hundreds of millions of dollars the foundation is putting into journalism, but you could look at the more than $10 billion the Gates Foundation has put into universities and the influence it then has over scientific research and academic studies, which are looking at how many lives the Gates Foundation is saving, the merits of the Gates Foundation's interventions. I mean, in all of these places where the Gates Foundation is working, these are really public policies, public health, public education, agricultural development that we would hope and imagine and would want to be organized through a public process, through democratic decision making. But what the Gates Foundation does is a large, powerful, wealthy private actor that can come in and tilt the scales of democracy. And suddenly it's Bill Gates' very narrow, neoliberal, retrograde ideology, his narrow technological solutions, that those become the agenda and the priority for everyone else. I mean, it's not the Gates Foundation acting alone, of course. It partners with wealthy governments and other institutions that support the same neoliberal sensibilities and have the same kind of approaches and strategies and solutions. But it is only one way to solve the problems. It's often not the most efficient or effective way, and it's certainly not the most just way.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs Magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
You've mentioned neoliberal ideology. I think it would be good if you explained a little more. Bill Gates, obviously, his kind of personal, idiosyncratic in some ways, vision that guides what the organization chooses to fund and the way it tries to approach the social problems that it tries to deal with, whether that is public health or whether that is education. Tell us a little bit more about the kind of guiding ideology that shapes the kinds of solutions that the Gates Foundation is willing to fund or to entertain.
Yeah, I would say that the Gates Foundation is entirely run by sort of the passions and the ambitions of Bill Gates. And to really understand what that ideology is, we have to go back to Microsoft, where Bill Gates made his fortune. So it's the same features of Microsoft, which is large multinational companies, the primacy of the private sector, market-based solutions. Bill Gates believes that his work at Microsoft, one of the world's most storied monopolies, helped usher in a computer revolution which drove incalculable social progress. And he believes that by bringing those same market forces and that same ideology to bear through philanthropy, he can help revolutionize agriculture and public health and public education. So all of the Gates Foundation's work turns around these same ideas about public-private partnerships, corporate partnerships, market-based solutions, market-shaping activities, the primacy of the private sector. So those are really the sort of the guiding ambitions and ideologies that animate the Gates Foundation's work.
And so how does that ideology translate into the kinds of solutions? Like, give us an example of how that ideology causes them to heavily push a particular kind of approach to a problem that obviously is not, in fact, the best approach to that problem.
So you could look at an area like public health. So Bill Gates loves vaccines. It's a biomedical technology. It's a very similar technology to software, to the computer market, where you spend a lot of money doing research and development. Once you have the product, it's very cheap to churn out diskettes of Microsoft Windows or this new vaccine. So Bill Gates likes pharmaceuticals. He works closely with pharmaceuticals because this biomedical technology, it really resonates with him. It's something that he thinks he has a value add. Of course, when you're thinking about public health, it's much bigger than pharmaceuticals. If we have limited resources, even with Bill Gates' money, you have to prioritize spending. You could spend it on building clinics and hospitals, on training doctors, on building roads to get people to hospitals. He likes the idea that you can just churn out vaccines, get them into the arms of the global poor, and then do some arithmetic and show the lives that you've saved. It's a very narrow approach to public health. Even if we look at the very narrow pharma-focused approach of the Gates Foundation in public health, Again, there's different ways to get vaccines into the arms of the global poor. And we saw this in the pandemic. The Gates model was trying to partner with pharmaceutical companies, trying to create this massive public-private partnerships. Meanwhile, you had poor nations around the world petitioning the World Trade Organization saying, why don't we challenge the patents of the pharmaceutical companies? Why don't we compel them to share their vaccine technology and get every capable manufacturing facility all over the world up and running, churning out vaccines to get the supply up? It would have been a much more equitable and just approach to the distribution of vaccines. But Bill Gates became out as one of the most public apologists and defenders of the status quo. Of course, defending the intellectual property rights of big pharma tacitly, indirectly supports the bottom line of Microsoft, in which Bill Gates remains a large investor. Microsoft's business model turns on the same intellectual property, copyright, patent concerns as the pharmaceutical industry. So I think you could see an indirect benefit at play there.
Well, you point out that they've been criticized by Doctors Without Borders, who do not have Gates funding for the approach to vaccines, and that some of the money that it looks like it's money that is being given, look at all this money we've given, in fact, flows into the pockets and the profits of private corporations.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the Gates Foundation is making charitable donations to companies like Pfizer. And you start to look at the actual work of the foundation beyond like the easy, glossy, naive sort of PR that's out there. It's really hard to square with the common definition of charity. How does it make sense that we taxpayers are richly subsidizing the Gates Foundation as it donates money to Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies? And also, what is the output? The Gates Foundation was donating money to Pfizer for the creation of a new vaccine. Pfizer created this vaccine for a respiratory virus, and it said it was going to make it available to enriched nations for wealthy consumers who could afford to pay high prices, but it didn't know when it would yet be available to the global poor. So again, you have to ask, is the Gates model of working with pharmaceutical companies really helping?
If we put on our effective altruist hats for a moment, we might ask the question, well, what is the measurable good that a charity or philanthropic endeavor does? I have my own criticism of effective altruism, but one of the things I at least like is that they turn our attention to the question of how do you actually measure what you've actually accomplished, which I think is quite important for a charity. And one of the things you point out in this book is that the Gates Foundation is very resistant to and very opaque when it comes to, well, okay, what have you actually accomplished? We know you've spent a lot of money. We know you've worked on these good things. We know we can read all the profiles of you doing all the stuff. We believe that you've saved some lives because we would expect the number wouldn't be zero after spending all of that money. But how do we actually tell whether you are using this money well? And that's a difficult question to answer.
Well, I don't know that it's difficult. I mean, it requires an ecosystem of research in which there is room and funding for independent critical perspectives of the Gates Foundation. And we don't live in that world.
Okay, I mean difficult in our world where they don't tell you anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this gets back again to the epistemic power of the foundation to fund so much of the research that tells us what the Gates Foundation is doing and the merits of what it's doing, and that so seamlessly can move the goalposts. The Gates Foundation said it was going to do X, but then you create a study that shows, the benefits or the merits of what it's doing. It wasn't what it planned to do. It wasn't what it said to do. I mean, I think that gets back to this level of the foundation's ability just to flood the zone with its own research and its reporting and its PR. It's arguably the most effective and most powerful feature of the Gates Foundation is its public relations machine.
Well, and you point out that they've given all kinds of different numbers for how many lives they've saved. Sometimes it's 2 million, 6 million, 100 million. It's often not quite clear, or I mean, you try to figure out, where the hell are these numbers coming from about how many lives they've saved?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, they all go back to the Gates Foundation, either the foundation itself or the research the foundation funds. So it's not a particularly honest or certainly not a particularly independent appraisal or evaluation of what it's doing. The Gates Foundation talks a big game of holding everybody else accountable. But if you try to hold the foundation's feet to the fire, to ask tough questions of them, to actually investigate what they're doing, you won't get very far.
When you talk about PR, I don't think I realized I'm critical of Bill Gates. I've written critically of Bill Gates. I don't think I realized until I read your book. I thought, hang on a minute. I've read all this stuff about how Bill Gates is reinventing the toilet. That's one of these things. And I went back and I looked, and every couple of years, there's a new wave of news stories about how Bill Gates is trying to revolutionize the world's sanitation by inventing a new type of toilet, not by plumbing infrastructure in places that don't have it, but reinventing the toilet. And I went back and looked at I was like, hang on a minute, with my Tim Schwab influenced critical eye, I thought, I don't see in any of this how many toilets they've built, how many people have gotten the toilets, why this is considered the best way to deal with the fact that people don't have toilets. There's all this missing information, but there's tons and tons and tons of news stories about how Bill Gates is reinventing the toilet.
Yeah, I like this. I like this infuriated attitude you have, Nathan, because that's how I feel too. I mean, I don't know. There's something about the news media that likes this story because of the scatological sort of the side of it, that it's a little naughty or something. And you'll have Bill Gates creating these like Starbelly Sneetches, massive machines that turn poop into drinkable water, and it shows him drinking water. It's like somehow it's like so perfectly primed for the news environment in which we live. And it's the same story ad nauseum for more than a decade. But yeah, exactly. At a point, why don't we say, you've been at this for a decade now, show us the results. How many lives are you saving with this? How many are you helping? At what point do we say, when are poor people just going to have clean water and sanitation? Why are they forever waiting on this technological solution from Bill Gates, this new engineered toilet that will never arrive, it will never manifest the revolution that he's promised? Where is that accountability journalism? We should write that story.
I certainly haven't seen any evidence, right? I've seen a lot of news stories, I've seen a lot of the video clips of her drinking the water. I couldn't believe it when I went back and I looked and I thought, okay, but where are the toilets?
I don't know that there are toilets. I don't think it's had any real measurable impact, which is why what we're left with, it's just this forward-looking kind of promise about, that's a big part of what the Gates Foundation does. It's always putting our eyes to the horizon, to the shining city on the hill that it's building, to this world where all lives have equal value. But I don't think it's really delivering that.
And, and if you look at the different domains in which they've operated, as you say, the toilets are kind of funny, but like, this could be dark. Like, when they wade into education with bad ideas and are extremely powerful and are able to use their money in order to get people to adopt whatever reforms pop out of Bill Gates's head, you threaten children's education.
Absolutely. It's not just a matter of, the Gates Foundation tried something and failed. You have to consider the collateral damage. These are teachers who are being told they don't know how to do their job by the Gates Foundation and need to be subjected to a measurement and evaluation schema that the Gates Foundation believes is right and important and righteous. These are kids who are being subjected to an endless culture of testing and surveillance that makes them feel that they aren't smart because they don't do well on a standardized test designed for rich white guys in Seattle, that Bill Gates himself did great on. So there's enormous collateral damage here. And this is where just the hubris and the arrogance of Bill and Melinda Gates come in, where they feel like, an issue like education, they will acknowledge their failures. They've spent billions of dollars, 2 decades of work. They've achieved almost nothing in education. But their point of view is that just because they haven't achieved more doesn't mean they should stop throwing the dart. And that's the dangerous hubris. I mean, you could look at an area like public health as well, where it's really an issue of life or death, the way we set priorities, the way we organize public health.
Well, and, you look back at Bill Gates's life to show us kind of who he is at the beginning of your book, because he's a very particular type of guy. He thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. In your introduction, you look back at the kind of shitty way that he treated a lot of his colleagues, bullying them, telling them all of their ideas were stupid. And you said, what rich white guy from Seattle perspective on the world, which is, I don't need to listen to these Africans about what they want. I'm going to come up with the solutions based on my understanding of math and science, and then I will fund the ones that I have decided are the best. I mean, there is this very, very deep arrogance to the man, and often he's wrong.
It's a terrible beggars can't be choosers model. It reduces something like public health or public education to a privilege to be administered by an eccentric billionaire in Seattle. Instead of understanding that something like access to vaccines or public health should be a human right, should be publicly organized. In many places today, a great many people today depend on the Gates Foundation to do things like get access to vaccines. And it's a model that we've had 2 decades to examine. We are long overdue to do that examination and to finally have a really robust, open, honest public debate about what the Gates Foundation really is and what it really is doing, not simply what it says it is.
I mean, it strikes me that in some ways, your book is not just a book about the Gates Foundation. It's a book about democracy, and it's a book about hierarchy, and it's a book about what happens when decision-making over the most important things in the world is vested in a sort of king, a sort of private, when you look at the organization, to the extent that we understand the organizational culture within the foundation, as you say, everyone signs NDAs, but to the extent that we understand it, Bill Gates wants to lay everyone off tomorrow. Sometimes that happens. It's one of these, well, we've got to defer to the genius at the top who knows how to fix all of our problems. And you're showing what happens when these decisions over really crucial areas of our lives are taken out of the realm of democracy, away from the people who are actually affected by the decisions, and placed in the hands of these unaccountable, concentrated private power centers.
Yeah. And so my book is about Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, but it's really a case study to think about the hundreds of other billionaires who have promised to follow Bill Gates' footstep into philanthropy. And what this portends is a political future in which our climate policy, how we regulate artificial intelligence, public health and public education going forward is increasingly the domain of a small number of tech billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, who have said that they plan to give away most of their money. So by understanding Bill Gates and the pathway that he's cleared through his philanthropy, we could sort of start to think about the bigger dangers. It sounds strange to talk about the dangers of philanthropy, but I do think that the hundreds of billions of dollars coming down the pike from these tech billionaires, it really is cause for concern, not cause for celebration.
As you point out, I mean, I don't know if you would go so far as to use the word manipulate research, but they certainly push the development of scientific knowledge in the directions they want it to go, and journalism in the direction they want it to go. And the greater control over the funding of the production of research and knowledge and facts, the more that is in the hands of these private institutions, I mean, the less we're almost able to tell the truth. It's really quite scary to think what happens when there is that amount of concentrated power and everyone's afraid to get on the wrong side of it.
Yeah, this level of extreme wealth is a threat to democracy. When we allow people to become this wealthy, like Bill Gates, some close to $120 billion in his personal bank account, according to current estimates, we know someone with that wealth will use it for political purposes, if not lobbying, if not campaign contributions, then as Bill Gates shows us, through philanthropy. In the hands of Bill Gates, philanthropy is a political tool. It's a political organization.
Tim, how does he have $120 billion in his bank account if he's so generous and gives it all away?
One of the endless paradoxes. Again, the news media is always talking about the money that Bill Gates is giving away. What about that $120 billion that he isn't giving away? He remains very interested in wealth accumulation. And we know this because you can look at his bank account. You can look at the way that he remains, he's become reportedly the largest owner of farmland in the United States. I think for him, it's just a financial investment. It's a way to make more money. His logic is, that the ends justifies the means, that eventually he's going to give away all the money, but he sure is taking a long time to do it.
Well, and as you point out, I mean, how much should we respect someone's generosity if the only thing they're giving away is something they don't need in the first place and have no use for?
Absolutely. I mean, is he a philanthropist or is he a miser? He's giving away money he could never possibly spend on himself. He's forsaking nothing through his philanthropy. Look at his mansions, plural mansions. Look at his private jets. Look at where he lives and how he lives.
Well, it's so funny you point out in the book how newspaper profiles inevitably kind of portray him as humble, and they're like, oh, he still wears the same clothes.
Soft-spoken, kind-hearted, avuncular.
Soft-spoken! Yeah. As if he lives modestly, but he doesn't live modestly. He lives in giant houses.
He lives large, and he'll always live large. He's always going to be super rich, and he's always going to use his wealth as a tool, as a political tool to influence the way the world works for the rest of us. There's something heroic in that model of exercising power in that way.
Well, in your book, you challenge us to think about how power can be wielded differently, how we can address these problems in a way that, incorporates the voices of those who are most affected by them and takes the power away from weird asshole billionaire. He really doesn't come across as a pretty unpleasant person, actually. It's just on an interpersonal level in a lot of the material.
Yeah, well, there's decades of testimonies from people at the Gates Foundation and Microsoft to attest to his personality. He is a hard-charging alpha male. I think, most people would say he's a grade A asshole.
Well, the book is The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of the Good Billionaire, and we don't have time to dive into the absolute wealth of findings that you've come up with over the years of your investigation. You've gone through every area that the Gates Foundation touches and showed what we know, what we don't know. It's really an extraordinary feat of reporting, and so I encourage everyone to pick it up. Tim Schwab, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me, Nathan. Appreciate it.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.